I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner.
I am Keith Yoder. I'm speaking from Brownsburg, Indiana. Fully retired from work, but I continue on a nonprofit basis working as a research fellow for the Warring States Project from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. It's basically a project run by E. Bruce Brooks, retired classical Chinese professor, and he is doing work and writing books on classical Chinese right now and Old Testament and a few other projects he's got going on. But I help him with the computer analysis, stylometric analysis.
You've worked quite a bit with a software program called Birds. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
That's Bruce has developed this over many years. It is basically an algorithm for comparing the stylometric similarity between two texts, and with a view to look at, say, rhetorical progression. Is it rhetorically similar, or possibly authorial identification? Is it a sense of plagiarism, or was it borrowed from another author, or was it by a different author? So those sorts of things.
I
must say, Bird uses, regardless of which language it's implemented in, and he's implemented in Chinese, and I've helped him implement it in Homeric, Greek, and New Testament Greek, and the Hebrew Bible. It basically uses the half dozen or 14 of the most common particles as the basis for analysis. And those particles in Homer, they comprise about 21% of the entire corpus. Interestingly, in the New Testament, those 14 most common particles comprise about 33% of the corpus. And in the Hebrew Bible, those particles comprise a little over 40% of the entire text. So, but anyway, the Bird uses particles, prepositions, conjunctions, that sort of thing, because those are the frequency would not vary that much depending on genre.
Right.
From one genre to the next. Of course, there are going to be differences, especially in poetry, but basically, if you look at content words, they're going to vary widely from one subject to the next.
Sure.
You look at the content, you look at the connector words, the particles, they don't vary that much. So it's a more useful tool, I think.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned about the Torah by applying Bird? Are there any big takeaways from that?
Well, yeah, there are quite a few examples, and I'm not going to be able to think of them off the top of my head. Like, for example, between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, those texts show a marked difference in style. In some books, the style is not all that cohesive, and in other books, it's very close. For example, Job is one of the tightest stylistic books in the entire Hebrew Bible. It exhibits and Psalms also. Now, there's some difference in Psalms, but Job is it shows like a you might say it would support a singular author as opposed to different. Not to say that it might not have been may have been developed or different editions, but it's very, very close stylistically. In the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark is very close stylistically, as opposed to, say, Matthew and Luke are a little bit looser. But Mark shows to my mind anyway, a singular authorship, and John also is very. If you go chapter to chapter, it's Bird shows a close similarity as you go along.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the Psalms. I'm curious if if the Bird results show that that's a pretty, how would we say it, pretty consistent text. That's interesting in view of the very well-known distinction between the Yoder Psalter, the so-called Elohist Psalter. Right, and so it really looks like, we would have different authors here. At least that's the common assumption. So do you think maybe the consistency is because even if we're dealing with different authors, they sort of have a linguistic archetype that they're following because of the Psalmic convention in use? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the genre plays there. Like I said, poetry is always a... can work differently as far as Bird, and I can't off the top of my head. It's been a while since I actually looked at that, but we did analyze, of the 5 books of the Psalter. I did do analysis book wide, and I can't tell you off the top of my head. I think there may have been some minor some differences, but not in a marked way. And I don't want to be held to that. I just I can't remember what the results were there. If they had been remarkable, I would remember it. I think. Sure. Why I'm not remembering it. But another example is Zechariah. The last several chapters of Zechariah are commonly felt to have been like from a different author or something. And Bird does bear that out. It would support that position.
Fascinating.
As far as Isaiah, the first, second, and third Isaiah, I can't remember on that either. I think third Isaiah, they show cohesion within, but second and third, there is some difference when you go from proto to deutero to trito, whatever the terminology is. But anyway, Bird is shown to be useful as an adjunct.
Right. Yes.
It doesn't stand on its own, but it can help support different literary analyses. In other words, Bird is an adjunct. It's another tool in the toolkit. Right.
Right, because scholars have long made a distinction between the so-called second, the deutero, and the trito Isaiah, right? And so, that theory was developed just even before the age of computers, just by close literary analysis. And so, in this case, Bird would be more or less, supporting, if not confirming, that previous non-computerized analysis. Fascinating. We'll get back.
I wanted to look at Radai. I forget his first name, Radai. He wrote a book back in the 60s or 70s. It's been a while ago, but he did some early computer analysis of the book of Genesis. And he divided it into speech and narrative. And there was some subdivisions. And someday I'd like to apply Bird to that differentiation of speech and narrative. The same as I've done in Homer, but that remains for a future day.
Right. Well, that's where I was just going to transition to. There is Homer, because made quite a bit of excitement in my life a few years ago when I received an email from you, right, about the Bird results for an idea that you had right, to run for Homer. So could you tell us what your idea was and what the results were and how to
Yes.
make heads or tails out of it?
The data set, the Homer data set for Iliad and Odyssey that I used was from Northwestern University. It's online on a website called the Chicago Homer, and you can download the complete data set from their website. But that database tags every word, whether it's speech or narrative. And conveniently, it falls out by lines. There's no line every line is either all speech or all narrative. So
Excellent.
That's not an issue. But interestingly, the Iliad, 111,700 and some words, is about 45% speech. The Odyssey, a smaller book, 87,000 some words, is a little over 55% speech. So so the Iliad is 45-55 speech narrative. The Odyssey is the reverse, 55-45. So what I did, I took each of the 24 books, and both epics have 24 books, and made two compartments for each book, one of all speech and the other of all narrative. So it makes a complete data set of 96 samples, 24 times 4. So you have 48 samples in the Iliad, 2 each for each book, one of speech, one of narrative, and ditto with the Odyssey. And when I applied Bird to that, interestingly, all of the Iliad speech samples were very close to each other, and they were also very close to all of the Odyssey speech samples. So so by themselves that would be 48 samples, and they showed a close cohesion in Bird. Similarly, the narrative samples of Odyssey or Iliad, the 24, were very close stylistically to the 24 narrative samples from Odyssey. But all of the speech samples, Iliad and Odyssey together, and all of the narrative samples, Iliad and Odyssey together, were stylistically separate. So it seemed like the big divide in Homeric epic is not between Iliad and Odyssey, it's between speech and narrative in both Iliad and Odyssey. It doesn't matter whether it was from Iliad or Odyssey. If it's speech, it's going to look like speech in the other book, and similar with the narrative. And that was my I discovered that just experimenting with Bird. So I took the Bird data then, the same data using the 14 most common particles, and I had to standardize it a bit so I could use it with the more commonly used statistical tools of principal components analysis and hierarchical clustering. And lo and behold, the results in those two algorithms, which both can be represented on a chart, a visual chart, so it's very nicely, you can see the whole thing in one picture. All of the speech, looking at the, first of all, in principal components analysis, all of the speech samples are on one side of the chart and mixed up, Iliad and Odyssey together, and all of the narrative samples are on the other side. And there is no mixing. There's no narrative on the speech side and no speech side on the narrative. It's very, very clear and very obvious. And that's using the most standard algorithm of principal components analysis, even with standardizing the variables. And then I used the, like I said, the other one, hierarchical clustering, which usually uses the dendrogram chart, where you have the tree coming down and dividing into branches and sub-branches and so forth. Well, there, the same split is complete and total. All of the narrative samples are on one side of the chart, and mixed up, Iliad, Odyssey, just kind of mixed up randomly. No particularly no particular division there. And on the other side, you have all of the branches of the narrative of both epics. So the bird results, to my mind, were completely justified and confirmed by principal components analysis and hierarchical clustering. And to me, it begs the question: and what's going on? There's something going on between both epics, so that the speech of one epic looks just like the speech of the other epic, at least in terms of the connectors, the particles, and ditto with the narrative. And so that's where I left it.
Yeah. So so if we had to stop, some person on the street, right? Some, non-scholar, and yet, they know about Homer, and that there's a generally prevailing opinion among scholars that, one person, let's say Homer, wrote the Iliad, but someone else wrote the Odyssey, because it's, it's so markedly different in so many different ways, just from a non-computer based, literary analysis, and a dialectical analysis as well. But the bird results, the first impression, one of the first impressions one might form would be what? That there were two people or two groups, we could say, but let's say two people working together. One was writing the narrative, one was writing the speech. Would that be sort of, the first impression that would be created upon seeing these results?
That would be one way to look at it, I guess. I guess you could have one author of the Odyssey and then another person who was totally schooled in that author's style, and in that halo effect, wrote the second book. I don't know, but and maybe there was something in the Bard era before it was committed to writing, or however that happened, that speech and narrative were sung in a different register or used different dialect or something. I don't know. I do not have knowledge to go personally. I don't know where to go on that, so I'll have to leave it with someone else to look at that.
Right. Well, we are doing an article together, and with a third co-author as well, Bernhard Long, at the University of Paderborn and University of Aarhus. Right, and so that's will be still maybe a couple of years away when that's published in an anthology that I'm co-editing together with Arya Rasvar at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And that's that book is on the origins of language and number, right? And so the study that you and I and Bernhard are doing on these bird results for Homer, right, are sort of tying into the origins and applications, I should have said, the origins and applications of language and numbers. So this is sort of like a applications of number idea here, but application of language is also involved because, right, we have to use the historical and linguistic knowledge to try to make sense of those bird results.
Right.
So it's utterly fascinating, and because of this impulse that you had or idea that you had to do this separation, right, of this speech and narration is utterly fascinating. Anyway, you've also created a series of Excel databases for a number of, let's say, ancient literature, right? Starting with the Bible, you've created these databases for the Masoretic Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint, or I should say, right, actually the Septuagint is just the first 5 books, right, of the Torah, and the rest of it is technically, we call it the Old Greek, right? So Septuagint is very loosely used for the whole, right, so-called Old Testament in Greek. And then you've created a database of the so-called Old Testament, right, for the Latin Vulgate, for Jerome's Latin Vulgate, right? So we have the Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And could you tell us, what, before we get to your other databases, but these biblical ones, what do they do, right? What service do they give to scholars?
Well, the aim was to put together an easy way to search for acronyms and acrostics. And say that an acronym would be looking at the first and last letters of words in a running text to see if those the accumulation of first letters or final letters themselves make a word, or have some intelligible order. Acrostic would be looking at either the first letter of a verse or a line and going down looking at successive first letters and see, and as in several of the Psalms are acrostic, notably Psalm 119 is very famous.
Sure, yeah, alphabetic acrostic.
And acrostic can also be seen sometimes in looking at the last letters of a verse or a line, and that's usually called the telestic. There wasn't any easy way to look through a corpus such as the Masoretic text or the Vulgate. And actually, you're the one that suggested that I do this. So I set about, I think the first one was the Hebrew Bible.
That's right, yes.
So these databases, like in Hebrew Bible, uses the regular, it's in the Excel, you have a field or a cell, and it will have all of the successive first letters in one cell, and then next to that with all the successive last letters, and for each verse, and then at the end of for each chapter, there's a summary of the first and last letters. But for the chapter, then it also has the first and last letters of each verse. So you can very easily look for acrostics, telestics, and acronyms forward and backwards simply by entering in your search box the letters you're looking for. And I set it up so that each cell, the text string, is separated by spaces. So if you wanted to look for the tetragrammaton, for example, you open up and I think for the Hebrew Bible, I have it separated into separate databases, one for the Torah, one for the early prophets, the latter prophets, and writings, just simply because of the size. And I have two separate tables, one for the Kare and one for the Ketiv, because you would have slightly different lettering for each one. Before I go further, I should mention each verse in each chapter also has word and letter counts. Sometimes the word counts become significant. But then as far as searching, then the user, whatever table you're looking at, say the Torah, bring up your Excel search box and put in the Hebrew letters in succession. For searching for the tetragrammaton, you would put in a Yod, then a space, then a Vav, space, a Hey, space, and another Vav. And it'll look through the entire database looking for examples, either of acronyms or acrostics. And if you want to, then you would do the reverse. You would enter in Hey, Vav, Yoder, Vav, Hey. Anyway, enter the letters in reverse with spaces, and you would find any reverse acronyms or acrostics. And you would have to do the same in the Ketiv tab and in the Kare tab. There may be differences, but so far I don't know if there are any. I did it that way so that all possible connections could be found.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's what I did in the Hebrew Bible. Then you asked me to do the Vulgate. I did the same for Jerome's Vulgate, and that's all. I think that's all in one big database. The reason why I separated the Hebrew Bible at first was it seemed like when you have text that's right to left, Hebrew,
Yes.
sometimes Excel would get very slow.
Right.
In searching or sorting or anything, and that the same thing happened with the Quran. But the Quran was somewhat smaller.
Yes.
The Hebrew Bible is just in terms of words is over 309,000. The Quran is more like 78 or 77,000. So the Quran isn't quite as unwieldy.
It's more comparable to the Torah, to the first 5 books.
Yes, right, exactly.
Right. Well, yes, and I'll throw in one more feature. Right, so we have this ability to search for acrostics and telestics, but also is what we call a mesostic, right? And so,
Right.
Right, and so here's one of the interesting acrostics, or actually mesostic, that I found thanks to your Masoretic text Excel database, and that was right. If we go to the opening chapter of Eicha or Lamentations, you'll notice in the first, you look at the first 4 verses. Well, first of all, we recall that chapter is an alphabetic acrostic. So, right, each verse is beginning with the consecutive letters of the Hebrew alphabet, right, Aleph, Bet, etc. But now, if you look at the last letter of each first word, right, now, so we get a pattern. And now this is going to be called a mesostic instead of an acrostic. A mesostic, so it's in the middle of the stick or the line.
Right.
Right, and so going down, you have the acrostic, of course, in those first 4 verses of Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. But now, if you go to the last letter of the first word of the 4th verse and then go up, and it's a reverse or bottom to top mesostic. That's the Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. And I think there's various arguments I've given, right, that sort of support that this looks to be intentional, especially in view of the Book of Lamentations throughout, right, is an acrostic text, and it has several well-known either horizontally encrypted acronyms of divine names, right, including the Tetragrammaton. So that's it. But this one, and there's another one also, but I won't go there for now. But this one, for instance, is nowhere in the literature, so no one's noticed this before, right? So either scholars haven't had the necessary software, or they haven't been creative enough in their thoughts, right? So let's go for a mesostic and reverse bottom to top. But in any case, that's a good example of something that of things that can be discovered that are not known, right, in the literature up to this point. Also, it also I should point out, not to be negative, but to face reality, that a scholar using these tools also has to retain a certain degree of creativity and thinking outside the box, right? Because, for instance, in the 3rd chapter of Lamentations, there is this marvelous telistic of the Tetragrammaton. But if we type in the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton, it won't come up. Right, you won't get a hit because it's what I would call, it looks like a Tetragrammaton permutation, right? So it's like the pattern is Yod, Yod, Hey, Hey, Vav, Vav, right? So, right, so, one has to, right, be creative and think outside the box. And so my point is the Excel databases, to a point, can think for you. Right, but there are cases where you have to be creative. like, it's like, oh, yeah, let's just type in Yod space, hey space, right, and see what happens. And so actually that is the pattern I think I found in the 3rd chapter, where it's the telestic is Yod, hey, vav, hey.
Oh,
right.
uh-huh.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating case. It's in verses 26 through 31. If anyone ever is listening to this wants to take a look at it, and you'll see why it's so fascinating. Because, like, the first letter involved in this telestic is the Yod of an Adonai in the open text, and the last letter in that telestic is a hey, right? But it's the hey of an explicit tetragrammaton in that verse 31. But it's even curious that it's set in verses 26 to 31, 26 being the numerical value of the tetragrammaton. It
Yes,
really looks so
right.
much in there, looks so intentional, right? So these, we still have to use a little bit of scholarly ingenuity, but these databases are really marvelous tools. And yes, you did. Let me put my reading glasses on. Just to, I want to mention another one of the little results that I got from looking at your database for Jerome's Latin Vulgate. And this is to whet people's appetite so that they'll actually go and actually download these free databases, right? And start discovering things for everyone, right? And this is something I noticed, right? So in the Vulgate, all right, so I was thinking about actually the Hebrew text of Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22 through 31. Right, that's a famous speech of we call her Lady Wisdom.
Right.
Right, very, very famous speech, very influential in Judaism, but also even in Christianity. Right, this is usually applied to Christ, in Christian thinking. But anyway, the commentaries, they tend not to mention that those 10 verses actually divide into 22 stichoi. Right, so immediately we're thinking, 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
Right.
So, but what's really fascinating is in the Hebrew text, lines the first 11 lines, so the first half contain 155 letters. And of course, I learned this from your Hebrew database, of course. So lines 1 through 11 contain 155 letters. Well, lines 12 through 22, so the second half of it, also contain exactly 155 letters. So it really looks so intentional. But what's really interesting was, so I thought, all right, let's look at the Greek, right, Old Greek, or the Septuagint of those 22 stichoi, right? And it didn't have this even division, right, matching letter counts for the lines. But when I looked at the Vulgate, it looks like it mimics this Hebrew feature. Of course, right, Jerome was translating the Latin Vulgate directly from the Hebrew. And right, so if you look at the Latin, as I discovered in your database, the first 11 lines, or the first half, contains 320 letters. And the last 11 lines, or the second half, contains, again, exactly 320 letters. So, a lot more research is needed, right? Because on this subject, because, of course, as you know, no one has ever done research into letter patterns, number patterns, acrostics, acronyms in the Latin Vulgate, right? But hey, we can start now, right? Thanks to your database. There was one more. I don't know if I pointed this out to you. Right. So one of the first things I searched for in your database for the Latin Vulgate was Deus, Latin for God, right? And in the Psalter, in the Vulgate Psalter, there was only one instance of it, right? And it incidentally, it was in Psalm 68, verse 34, right? So it's the only verse. But the reason I point this out is that we have to, we meaning all scholars who are interested in these types of literary patterns, have to be careful with our assumptions, because my assumption was I'm going to find Deus everywhere. Right? It's going to be very common. Right? It's a simple sequence of letters in Latin, so I'm going to probably find 20, 30, 40 right in the Psalter. But in fact, it's an extremely rare sequence of words. I mean, a sequence of letters, either by abstracting an initial or terminal, series of letters. And I'll read that verse, right? And keep in mind that the U and the V, right, are interchangeable in Latin,
Right.
And so maybe you'll catch it. It's in the first letter. You abstract the first letter of a series of 4 words, right? And quoniam exadivit pampares dominus et vinctos suos non dispexit, right? So the first letter of Deus, right, is the first letter of the word dominus, right? So that's very fitting. Dominus et is the E, vinctos,
Right.
the U or the V, suos, right? And it's fascinating. It's an interesting case, but that sequence is found either horizontally or vertically only one time, right? Of the 150 psalms in Latin. So one has to be careful with assumptions, right? Right. So, well, in any case, it's quite fascinating. You've already mentioned. I was going to introduce the topic, but you've already mentioned that you've created a database of the Arabic Quran. But I should jump in there and say that originally it's probably a couple of years ago now, you created a database for what's called the Hafs. It's the most widespread version that's used among Muslims for the Quran. The Hafs version with what is called Imale, or a simplified spelling, right? For instance, in that version will supply explicitly a lot of aleph in medial position, right, somewhere within a word, as opposed to beginning or end of a word. And so that's more of a modern way of spelling. I guess in a sense you could call it the Plane, right? Plane spelling.
Okay.
Right, and then what you've recently completed just some weeks ago, my bidding was, right, so the Hafs database, searchable database, of the so-called original, right, Hafs, right, so without the simplified spelling, right, which is called Imle. And so there you get generally fewer letters in words. And so, right, you get different letter counts, right, in a lot of verses. But in any case, of course, there's a lot of interest in the Quran, right? I think there's over 1 billion Muslims on the planet. And there is some interest in like numerical patterns. But as far as like the idea of acronyms or acrostics being present in the Quran, when one studies Quran at university, for instance, or anywhere in a traditional setting or in a Western academic setting, you are told, well, yeah, in contrast to the Bible, there are no acrostics in the Quran. So you're told that, and so you never look, right? The students are just going to believe what they're told generally, right? But in fact, with the aid of your database, right, I tried to, I did searches for what I would call techniques, scribal techniques that I, found throughout the Hebrew Bible. I wanted to see if we have something similar in the Arabic text of the Quran. And sure enough, right, I found abundant instances. And I'll give you one example. which is really intriguing, right? So the third chapter, or what's called the Surah of the Quran, towards the end of it, we get a lot of explicit mentions of the divine name Rabbana, so our Lord, right? And it's mentioned a handful of times. It's really predominates. And so it's very curious, which I discovered through your database. If you look at the last three verses, or what I call the ayat, the last three verses of that chapter 3, you notice at the end with the letters Ra, Ba, Nun, which are the first three letters of Rabbana. And Rabbana is 4 letters, the last letter being Aleph, so terminal Aleph. Well, so where is the Aleph in this telastic? It's a telastic. Well, it's there at the end of the first verse of the next chapter. Oh. So it's sort of like you know, this technique that joins 2 chapters together, which you can find also in the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, you look at the first and the second of the Psalms, right? So the opening of the Psalter, you'll notice that again, this is a mesostick. If you look at verse 6 of the first Psalm, you'll see that it ends with the letter Yod. All right. So if you follow that pattern and into the first 3 verses of Psalm 2, you'll see that it completes it. It's Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. So it's like this tetragrammaton mesostick that joins together those 2 psalms. And of course, there's a lot of debate among scholars, as you know. Are those sort of like a diptych, or are they written separately? The assumption usually being that Psalm 1 is later than Psalm 2. But either compositionally or the level of redaction, presently in the form we have it, right, they are connected with this really neat tetragrammaton mesostick. And I won't, well, yeah, let me supply a little bit of detail here for scholars listening to this who may be skeptical that, you know, this may just be random or a coincidence. There's an abundance of evidence, I think, that's indicative of it not being that way. And what I mean is there's a lot of letter and numerical patterns involving numerical values of the divine names in those 2 chapters. As briefly as possible, I'll put it this way. There are 2 tetragrammatons in Psalm 1, in verse 1 and verse 6, right, in the plain text. If you count your letters, well, it's in verse 2, excuse me, sorry. The first tetragrammaton is in verse 2. Now, if you count the letters beginning of verse 1, when you get to the 65th letter, that will be the Yod of Yod He Vav He in verse 2. All right, that's just curious, right? Because 65 is the numerical value of the traditional tetragrammaton substitute Adonai. Now, when you get to verse 6, to the second tetragrammaton, you will notice that its Yod is letter 26 to the end of Psalm 1. 26, right, is the numerical value of the tetragrammaton. All right, so, I mean, still curious, but, you know, this could still all be coincidence, right? Until you realize that in Psalm 2, the first tetragrammaton is word 26, right? Now, you go to the final tetragrammaton of Psalm 2, right? And that's in verse 11. So it's a much longer psalm than Psalm 1. The last tetragrammaton in Psalm 2, if you start counting at the Yod, right, to the end of Psalm 2 will be 65 letters. So that Yod is 65th to the last letter, right? So the pattern there between Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 is the numerical is 26, is 65, 26, 26, 65. So it's a chiastic structure. Okay. Right, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. You could go on, right? Because actually, if you, right, so this Yod He Vav He mesostick, which starts with the last letter of the first word of verse 6, which is the last verse of Psalm 1, that's actually, if you start at verse 1, and you look at the last letter of the first word, and then continue that pattern, you have Yod, Yod He, Aleph, Lam. Aleph Lamed. I'm falling back into the Arabic there. Aleph Lamed, right? So that's Yod, Yod Hey, which are the first two letters of the Tetragrammaton, or the divine name Yah, and then Aleph Lamed, right, which is El, the short form of Elohim. So you have Yod, Yod Hey, Aleph Lamed, Yod Hey Vav Hey. This nice mesostick going from verse 1 of Psalm 2 to verse 3 of Psalm 2. But anyway, enough of that. But that's all thanks to your database and a little bit of creative thinking on my part. But you put the two together, right? The technical resource and a little bit of creative thinking, and some really extraordinarily intriguing patterns show up in these databases that you've created. We talked about this one before. This one I was looking at, well, of course, is very famous in the table, the genealogical table in Genesis chapter 5. Thank you. I was about to say 3, but that's still in the Garden of Eden. The genealogical table, right? These 10 generations in chapter 5, which famously, right, has the account of Enoch or Henoch, and he lived 365 years, and he was not. God took him. All this. I started counting the words in that chapter just with a yod, right, with a little stick, right, physically, right, in my Torah here. And as I was reaching the end of it, it was getting curiously close to 365. And so I was at like 350, and I said, wait, I'm just going to take a look at Keith's database. And there it was. It shows that the word total for chapter 5, that genealogical table, is 365 words.
365, yeah.
Right? And so it's, to me, it's like, yeah, that's clearly intentional in order to, on a subtle level, esoteric level, to hint at the importance of Henoch in that table, right? And well, anyway, so it's really a rich resource. See, I could have looked at it first instead of counting by hand 360 words before I confirmed it basically by looking at your database. Again, one more example. I'll give 2 examples from your Septuagint database, and I'm doing this to whet everyone's appetite who's listening. First of all, in Genesis, the first 2 verses in the Septuagint, you'll notice that there are 10 words in the Greek, or there's 7 in the Hebrew, but 10 in the Greek because it's wordier, and for instance, words tend to be longer, but even the definite articles, right, are separated, right, from the nouns that follow. So we have 10 words, which is probably, it's really neat Pythagorean touch, I think. But in any case, 38 letters, but the first half of the verse divides into 19 letters, and the second half divides into 19 letters. So it's very nice and even, 19 plus 19. And then the second verse, which everyone will know is much longer than the first verse, in the Septuagint has 91 letters, right? So it's this nice, like 19, and then, right, switch it around, you get 91. Of course, right, they're using things based on decads, right? So it's like 90 and 1. So a 10 and 9 is like transformed into 90 and 1. But anyway, so 1991, you can, by looking at the word totals and letter totals, you can, make out patterns like that. But of course, again, you have to use a little ingenuity, because if you look at your database, right, for Genesis 1, 2 in the Septuagint, you'll see the letter totals for verse 1 is 38, and the letter totals for verse 2 is 91. So you don't catch it until you realize that semantically, right, verse 1 divides cleanly into 19 plus 19 letters, right? Which is significant because the Hebrew text divides cleanly, semantically, between 14 plus 14 letters. right? So it really looks like, you know, a lot of care, right, went into that Greek translation, just as it apparently went into Jerome's Latin translation from the Hebrew. The last thing is in Exodus 3, in the Masoretic text, where Moses is asking God about his name. Look, you know, what's your name? I'm going to have to tell this to the children of Israel. They're not going to believe me. And they're going to ask me, yeah, what is this God's name that sent you to us? And so if you look at the Masoretic text at the final letter of a series of words there in Exodus 3. Do I have it here? Let's see if I have it. Yeah. So you have towards the end of verse 13 in Exodus 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words from the end, right? You'll see li, so the preposition, right, to me, right? So what shall I say? To me, li, ma, shmo, ma. Well, you look at the last letters there, of course, you see yod, he, vav, he, right? So what is his name? So to me, what is his name? You see, you see the answer, right? Now, of course, scholars debate if this is, you know, intentional or not. But the curious thing is, if you look at Septuagint of that same verse, right? In the Septuagint of that same verse, well, you have the, instead of li, you have me, of course, me. And then it's followed by ti, anima, auto, right? And so there, I'll wait for you. It looks like you got your Septuagint there. You're a good scholar. So if you look at Exodus 3, verse 13, and here it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 letters to the end. All right, so T. On the alto, if you look at that, the last letters, right, are of those 3 words abstracted are iota, alpha, omega, right, which is the standard Greek version of the Tetragrammaton, in the same words and in the same direction and in the same place. It's as in the Masoretic text, right? It's in the reading direction in the Masoretic text, left to right, and it's the last letter of each of the series of words that you abstract. And here it's also the last letter of a series of words you abstract going in the plain reading direction, which is the opposite of Semitic language, right? Right to left, right here in Greek. So, right, so I discovered that by typing in, you know, iota, alpha, omega in your Septuagint database. And it really blew me away. And I thought, well, you know, the only incongruence there with the Hebrew is that the Hebrew has the yod in the word that precedes, li, right? And here it's me. But it will work in Greek as well if you say epsilon, iota, alpha, omega, right, for a fuller version of the Tetragrammaton in Greek, right?
Yes.
Because there's a lot of different spelling variations, right, for even the 4-letter version in Greek of the Tetragrammaton in early patristics. Some use the epsilon, others use the eta, right, the long vowel. But in any case, those are some of the really rewarding types of patterns you can find by using these databases.
That's striking. That's very striking.
Yes, it is. Now, you've also created databases for the works of Virgil and then Dante. I think that's it, isn't it? Or was there another one that I'm forgetting? Dante's Divine Comedy,
right?
The complete works of Virgil, right? And so, right. So these are good tools not only for biblical scholars but also for scholars of classical literature who are interested in Virgil and Dante, right, which is of course significantly later than Virgil. But still, we do know that, at least for instance, Dante was interested in. There are some acrostics that are known in the literature, but what I noticed this was actually what prompted me to ask you to create the database for the works of Dante, a searchable acrostics acronym database. And that is, I noticed, right, that in the final stanza of the Divine Comedy, again, it's a mesostic. If you look at the first letter of the last words, right, in this set of 3 lines, because the way that Dante does this is each stanza is composed of 3 lines together and then a separate 4th line, right? So if you look at those last 3 lines, the first letter of the first letter of the last word in each line, so technically a mesostic, is P, V, and M, right? Which really stands out because those are the initials for Publius Virgilius Maro, the full name of Virgil. And the reason this is important is because, right, in the open text, right, in the narrative of Dante's Divine Comedy, the pagan poet Virgil is his guide throughout purgatory, right? And then after purgatory, Virgil disappears, and right, his guide is the famous Beatrice, who is sort of like his symbol somehow concealing the Virgin Mary, I think. But what's fascinating is that the initials of Virgil are there in the final stanza, as if there's like this esoteric, enduring presence, right, of Virgil. And the reason that stands out is because in the works of Virgil, right, Virgil scholars are aware that Virgil himself encoded his initials, right, his 3 initials for his 4, right? So it's as if Dante here is mimicking that, and he's doing it in a very precise, very prominent place, the last stanza, right? It's so of course, I did this PVM sequence search in your database, and I won't go into the results, but that was the reason why I asked you to create that. And I hope scholars, will download that as well. Those who work with Dante. I'm not going to say much about your Virgil database because there's a large number of scholars who have published on acrostics in Virgil. So it's an open field, but there is so much more in there that I've discovered beyond what's there in the literature so far. It's really a rich resource, and instead of talking about the acrostics, like encrypted words in Virgil, what I'll say is this database you've created is very, very helpful for something that's related to that, and that is I noticed it's very, very frequent, right, all throughout Virgil. It's very frequent that he will have, let's say, in one line he starts off with a word, and let's say the first 3 letters of that word are SIC, and then you'll notice that the next line begins with an I, and then the next line after that will begin with a C. Oh, so right, so it's sort of like what's called a gamma acrostic, right? And this is extraordinarily frequent in Virgil. I don't think scholars know this unless they have access to some kind of database, right? Because it takes an inordinate amount of time, right, to go through Virgil and look for these types of patterns. But this is very frequent, and what it is, it's usually the first several letters of a word in a line. And then that word, the letters of that word are going to be found then, right, as an acrostic, but it's incomplete, right? So it's it's an incomplete acrostic, but it's in this what's called the gamma acrostic format, but it's incomplete, right? So lots that can be done. All right. You really need to be.
Well, the longer the word, the more difficult it would be to complete the acrostic, obviously.
Yes. Well, I've talked about this in other interviews, right? There's what's called well, you know, the famous French 19th century linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Right, his theory of the radical, what's called the radical arbitrariness of language, right, is like a cornerstone of linguistics till this day. Even though towards the end of his life, Saussure realized that theory can't be correct. Right, so he sort of but he didn't publish on that insight because he could never figure out, you know, what to replace it with. But he had this other theory that he never published because he couldn't figure out if it was dealing with randomness or intentionality. And that is, for instance, in the Iliad, he noticed that in a passage where Agamemnon is mentioned, he noticed that before and after the mention of the name Agamemnon, the letters and the letter sequences and the phonemes of the name Agamemnon begin to proliferate, right? And then they're still proliferating after the name is mentioned, and then it sort of fizzles out, right, as the action goes on to something else. So this was, you know, he considered this some kind of, you know, vestige of an Indo-European poetic technique, but he couldn't figure out if it's just random, right? So, right, was it a real poetic technique or not? Well, Roman Jakobson, who was a very important Russian linguist of the 20th century, you know, who had immigrated to America, his theory was that, well, this Saussurean anagram, and Saussure called it an anagram theory, sort of like acronym, anagram. Perhaps some of these elaborate letter patterns were not random, but they may not have been produced consciously by the poet. They could have been produced from the subliminal powers, right, of the poet, right? And so this led me to develop sort of like a threefold model, right? Because now we have to be more sophisticated. We can't just ask, well, is this acronym or acrostic intentional or random? We have to ask, well, is it intentional or random, or is it non-random yet non-intentional, right? So it could have been something that came from the subliminal powers of the poet, right, without the conscious knowledge, right? And so you have extraordinary, you know, patterns, letter patterns and sound patterns. So what I believe is that Jakobson went too far. I think that these extraordinary patterns are probably the result of a combination of the poet's subliminal powers and his conscious powers of artistry. So, right. So we don't want to shortchange, you know, the genius of these ancient poets, but they certainly don't. It doesn't appear that they were conscious of all of the patterns that we can find in them, right? And so these like incomplete acrostics, right, that I found through your database in Virgil could be, right, maybe to a certain degree, these subliminal patterns, right, that he maybe not had even been consciously aware of, right? Because you start a line with a certain word, and in your unconscious or subliminal level, right, it's going to have an impact, right, in your memory and in your subliminal mind, or the subliminal reaches of your consciousness, right, in the next line and then the next line after that. You know, by virtue of the power, it's wielding, right, because of its dominant initial position.
There is another classification of database that that's on my website, and that is the repeated lines in Homer. And those, I have them in 4 different formats, and it relates repeated lines that are, let's say, might only appear once in the Odyssey, but or in the Iliad, but it's repeated often in the Odyssey, and vice versa. Those have been my most downloaded databases from my website historically. I think I first posted them back in 2015. and they've been downloaded all over the world. They found there's apparently a wide interest in repeated lines in Homer. But that's actually, I think Homer, the number of repeated lines in the Iliad is about 16%. There's 15,693 lines, and there's 16% of them are repetitions of one another. There's slightly more in the Odyssey of 21. Odyssey is 21%, but the Odyssey is also repeating some lines from the Iliad, so as well as within itself.
The reason I sought you out on the internet so many years ago now, that was your work on the parable, Luke's parable of Lazarus, right? And how this seems to be so intimately an inspiration for John, the Gospel of John, and his character of Lazarus, this curious Lazarus name. And then, of course, your argument. I'll let you tell the audience that your argument about specifically the Luke's parable. So, what is this name Lazarus in this parable? So.
Yes, I think I started with Lazarus back in 2010 or 2011, working on it a little at a time, but I did publish at the end of 2019 in Novum Testamentum an article on Lazarus in Luke's parable as the precedent for Lazarus is Abraham's servant Eliezer. And there are some very striking parallels, commonalities especially between the first paragraph of Genesis 24, where Abraham sends his servant off to get a wife for Isaac, and what happens in Luke 16. In particular, one of the closest parallels, of course, is in the bosom of Abraham in the parable, matches up with the servant placing his hand under Abraham's thigh in Genesis 24. And it's been argued, I think, been established by previous scholars that under the thigh and the bosom in Luke 16, it really is Abraham's lap.
That's right. Yes.
So
it would be the same Hebrew word as in Genesis.
In Genesis 24, the servant, presumably Eliezer, is under Abraham's thigh, and the poor man in Luke 16 is on top of Abraham's thigh. So there's nothing else like it, like that. That's sort of contact, and there's numerous other contacts. Anyway, I submitted that article first to another journal in 2019, and they rejected it.
New Testament studies.
So, yes,
let's call them out. Let's call them out.
Okay. I wasn't going to do that, but thank you. I didn't really change all that much. Maybe I polished it a bit, and I made a few additions, and I submitted it to Novum Testamentum, and lo and behold, they published it, and I was very gratified at that. And I have to say that's been, I've since published 2 other essays on Novum Testamentum, but that essay from December of 2019 has been downloaded from Novum Testamentum, which is behind a paywall. You have to either pay for it individually or have a subscription, and it's not available yet on JSTOR. But it's been downloaded about 650 times total.
Yeah, it's an important essay.
So it's been widely disseminated, and on my website, I have the final author's manuscript version, which is basically the same, but you don't have all the Brill formatting. That is very popular, especially in the last couple of years. It's been downloaded quite a bit. But then from there, let's linger on that essay just a little bit more, if we may, because they claim that the parable's Lazarus is named after Abraham's
servant, Eleazar, is quite a controversial claim. So can you explain to us why that's the case?
Well, they're quite, I wrote like a 26-page essay. So first of all, the name, if you look at, I forget her name, Tal Elon, wrote a very good book on proper names in Hebrew proper names in antiquity, going from the last few centuries BCE and then the first couple centuries CE. So the name, if you look at Eleazar, there's a couple variants in the Old Testament. One is Eliezer and the other was Eleazar. But all occurrences of both of those names, I believe, if I'm remembering it right, in Septuagint are collapsed down to Eleazaros, a single name. And then you look at the proliferation of how Eleazaros appears in these, and these are among Jewish, it's proper names among Jews in those centuries. There are about, I believe, about 50 different variants. Quite a few different variants. I'm sorry, I think there's 65 occurrences and maybe 12 or 13 different variants of how that name is spelled, and Lazarus is one of them. So there's Eleazaros, there's Lazaros, Leazaros, Eoazaros, all sorts of different variations. And Lazaros, as it appears in Luke and John, is just one. There is one other in the New Testament in the genealogy in Matthew. Eleazar appears. Anyway, going from Elon's book and her data, it's just there is no question that Lazarus is just a variant of Eliezer in Genesis. And in fact, not Philo, but Josephus, he doesn't talk about the Eliezer of Abraham's servant, but there is another Eliezer, I believe it's either a son of Aaron or a son of Moses. And Josephus translates that by Eleazaros. So there's just no doubt in my mind that these are just two variants of the same name.
Right.
And but the name, the variant Lazaros, is rare enough so that it's not coincidental that the same variant is used in Luke and John. Right.
Now, what I was hinting at was earlier scholarship, before the publication of your essay, earlier scholarship has really heaped scorn on the claim, right, that this Lazarus in the parable is named after Abraham's servant. That's was what I meant. It's controversial claim, and so that's why I'm saying that this essay that you've written, which was published in a very prestigious peer-reviewed journal of the field, is very important, because it's basically, I think, is eventually going to turn the scholarly consensus around, right, to accept the argumentation that you have, which was argued, I forget who it was by, a German scholar a couple hundred years ago or so. Do you recall that scholar's name? Geiger?
Yeah, a man named John Lightfoot back in the 1600s proposed that. And as you said, the scorn on that view, nowhere more evident than in John P. Meyer's, I think his second volume of The Marginal Jew. He extensively excoriates that, and I think unfairly so. And I suppose part of my impetus in writing was just to counteract that. That unfair, what to me I thought was unfairly, an unfair presentation that he made. In my opinion.
I think the facts are on your side, and I think that's why Novum Testamentum jumped at your article. And I was privileged, right, to offer comments and suggestions, as you were writing it. and which was really personally fulfilling for me, right? Because that's the genesis of our knowing each other. Goes back to that topic. Maybe this can serve as a lesson for potential authors out there, scholars who are thinking about submitting something. Like, if you get rejected, don't give up, right? Try a different journal, right? Just try a different journal, because to be quite frank about this, there is injustice, right, in academia. And sometimes prejudices do influence editorial decisions, right? Especially in religion, but certainly not just in religious studies, right? But especially in religious studies, I think there are a lot of prejudices at work. And so personal beliefs are sometimes at stake, and consciously or unconsciously, and I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, unconsciously, they may commit acts that objectively speaking, are a little unfair. Now, well, you shared with me some of the details of what was said, and I immediately wrote back to you and said that this is outrageous. It's outrageous what they're saying. And so I said, try to submit it to maybe Novum Testamentum, right? And so you did, without changing all that much, as you said. Right? No. It wasn't, it was basically the same paper, and they thought that. Well, of course, they thought it was excellent. Jumped at the opportunity, right? Because they recognized this is a really important paper, because it has solid argumentation to really blow out of the water, right? All of this scorn heaped upon this simple and I think very persuasive claim that in the parable of Luke, Lazarus is named after the servant Azar, the servant of Abraham.
And then my third and final essay was on the relationship between Lazarus in John and Lazarus in Luke. And anyway, my point there is that as a literary composition and as a literary composer, John was influenced by Luke's parable. Definitely influenced, because there's undeniable crossovers and literary DNA from Luke, and and I even argue that John was also triangulating off of Genesis 24, and actually Genesis 22, 23, and 24, all dealing with with death and facing death and burial, and Lazarus and Isaac emerging unscathed, and so forth. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's the figure of Abraham and his son is already really prominent in the first chapter of John, even though a lot of people may miss it, right? Because Abraham becomes sort of like a figure type for God, the Father, right?
Absolutely.
And Isaac is a type of figure of the only begotten God, as the original Greek apparently read. So, and it talks about the bosom of the Father. That is not Father Abraham, but God, the Father, the bosom, right? And so this, so this Abrahamic trope is there on a very subtle level, right? And this curious, I think, I know I've mentioned this to you before, that I think it was Balcom and Mencken and others, they were probably the first two who brought attention to the possibility of gematria being at play in John chapter 1, right? Because of in Greek, the monogenes, the only begotten Son is 496, value of 496. But that's curiously exactly double of the Hebrew numerical value of Abraham, right? 248, Avram.
Oh.
So you just double it and you get 496. So I think that John is going there, and he was playing in this way between Hebrew and Greek, which is an attested phenomenon, a literary technique, right, in ancient wordplay texts throughout the ancient East. These bilingual techniques. But in any case, already in the opening chapter, right, Abraham is there, even though it's not mentioned, but it's clearly the typology, right, of Abraham and the Akedah, right, but just as a typology for the divine Father and divine Son. But see, that's another hot topic, though, because if you're going to argue that there's a literary DNA that links Luke's parable with John's gospel, that's another hot button, because there's a big component of New Testament gospel scholarship that, you know, will go to war, you know, over the claim that John knew any of the synoptic gospels. Yes. Or availed himself of them, right? So it tends to be the more conservative evangelical scholars who do this, but it's probably, to be fair, it's probably not, you know, limited to them, but there's certainly, that is a hot button for especially that group. And you know, I don't mean to disparage them at all. Everyone's entitled to their opinions, but you know, we have to try to be aware of our opinions and control for them, right, in our scholarship. Right? So yeah, you like hot buttons, I think.
Well, that thing with Luke and John has been ever since C.H. Dodd, and before him, yes. There was an English scholar in the 30s that wrote a very, very influential book. I can't think of his name now, but he influenced even the German scholars that John was independent.
Right.
That's been around for a long time.
For a long time.
But on the thing of Abraham as a type or a model for God the Father, that thought seems to be, it's not just in John, but you see it in Paul too.
Yes.
In Romans 8.
That's where I think John gets it from.
He who did not spare his only son, and the language there in the Greek almost perfectly matches the language in Greek, the Greek translation in Genesis 22.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, John gets a lot from Paul, in my opinion. You did go through seminary and learn Greek.
Oh, I did. Oh, yes.
Yes, and your Greek is...
I got a complete MDiv and studied Greek and Hebrew. Even in college, I took Greek and Hebrew before seminary. And then during seminary, I had a whole year course down at Dropsy, was then Dropsy College of Hebrew and Cognate Learning, on Canaanite inscriptions with,
right.
Oh, I can't remember the man's name now. Just a marvelous Jewish scholar. I loved that class.
Right. In any case, you're, you know, I'm very familiar with your knowledge of Hebrew and Greek, but especially your Greek right now. And I know a lot of the abilities, I know the linguistic abilities, Greek abilities of a lot of very famous New Testament scholars. I won't name any names. A lot of them can't even begin to approach your level. And part of that is a little shocking to me, right? But, you know, I don't know why that is, a general decline, I guess, in scholarship requirements.
For original languages, yeah.
Yeah, but, you know, so I didn't want the audience to have any inadequate impression, right, of your professional abilities. You're
Thank you.
A wonderful, you're an incredible Greek scholar, and your Hebrew really is wonderful too. Yeah. So, what do you have plans for the future in your work?
Well, couple things. I was working. I had been working on looking at repeated words. It's called epizeuxis in Greek, but for example, comfort, in the beginning of Isaiah 40,
right? Yes.
Or Abraham, several, and I've looked in the looking at the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, and they don't match up quite, but they're very close. It'll be somewhere around 250 to 300 examples, and what drove me to that is the way that John, in the Gospel of John, a lot of my thoughts start there. He seems to major on repeated words, is verily, verily, amen, amen. Now the synoptics use the amen, I say to you, but only John says amen, amen, and he does that 25 times. And then there's three striking examples in the Passion narrative of other words. And anyway, that's nobody's made any systematic study of that. And before I I'm trying to write an article on that, and I needed to do some background in it. And it's anyway, that's one thing I'm doing. And another more long term, I want to purify my Hebrew Bible database, not my acrostic databases, but my I have a Hebrew Bible Tanakh for data analysis. That's been downloaded a lot, and I know that I used an early version of the Westminster Leningrad Codex, and I corrected many problems with it. But
the Westminster files.
When I was doing the Epizeuxis search, I found one place where my database had substituted a MAME for a SAMIC. You know, they kind of look alike. It was one or the other. I can't remember. I thought, oh boy, I wonder how often that happens. Probably not. It's probably pretty rare, but I have the latest version of the Westminster Leningrad Codex is online, but it's not lemmatized or analyzed. It's just the words, the text. And what I want to do is coordinate that Unicode text against mine and just make sure that everything is correct. And that's going to take some work because in my database, you know, I separate all the inseparable prefixes out as separate lines. So it's going to take me a while.
Sure.
But it's usable, very usable in the form it is. But you know, you always want to be perfect. So there's always work to be done.
Of course. Of course, yeah, very good. Well, Keith, it's been very fascinating and a joy to spend this time with you. I really appreciate your time.
Likewise. I enjoy talking with you, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.